Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I greet you warmly from Jamaica in your various capacities. We gather at a time when artificial intelligence joins the pantheon of great human inventions that permanently reshape society. The invention of painting, photography, film, etc., is about humans attempting to replicate ourselves and what we observe and experience. Generative artificial intelligence helps us to do the same. In that sense, it is like old wine in a new bottle, except that the scale and scope of its impact are unprecedented. Anyone can now make fake images, videos, and audio at the speed of thought, and so real that we default to positions of disbelief and distrust in what our eyes have seen and ears have heard. What does this portend for society when we begin to question the truth of a palpable and visceral experience with our parent, child, our child's teacher, our doctor, lawyer, or spouse, when critical information is received from emergency services, such as an immediate evacuation order or a determinative statement by a political aspirant on the eve of an election, or when there is breaking news from a presumed trusted media source. If untruth and disbelief scale to a point where we normalize fiction, fraud, and distrust, society becomes dysfunctional and a mere carcass. Hence, exhortations such as that of the late Professor Stephen Hawking that AI poses an existential threat to humanity. But a threat does not equate to an inevitable outcome. Neither is our choice a binary one of utopian AI hype or crippling AI dystopia. The more we all know about AI, the more we can actively shape its development and use it for the good of society. But for this to happen, there must be openness, inclusivity, and not just access, but enlightened access. People of all walks of life who will be or are being affected by AI should have a say about it. That is the purpose of today's discussion. It is one of eight from around the world, culminating on September 28 when we meet on the GatherTown platform for the flagship AI for IA virtual conference with over 68 global speakers. All of this information from today's panel, the others to come, and on September 28th, that information is being made available as part of our collective task to eliminate information asymmetry and write instead, hopefully, a story about human flourishing. I conclude by thanking members of the UNESCO IFAP Working Group on Information Accessibility, which I have the pleasure of chairing, the small band of AI for IA conference organizers from India, Jamaica, UK, Canada, USA, Chile, Ukraine, Germany, China, South Africa, and Botswana, supported by the UNESCO IFAP Secretariat in Paris, the UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa, the UNESCO Cluster Office for the Caribbean, the Broadcasting Commission of Jamaica, University of Alberta in Canada, and the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. Most of all, I extend gratitude to the Carnegie Council, our partner for today's panel discussion. It is now my pleasure, a great delight, to hand over to the moderator, Ayushi Kemka. Ayushi is a PhD student and Killam laureate at the Department of Philosophy, University of Alberta.
Thank you, Caudle. I hope everyone can hear me and see me very clearly. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you so much for joining us virtually at this panel discussion today. As Caudle said, I am Ayushi Khemka and I'm a PhD student at the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Alberta. So, our discussion today is going to be on AI and information accessibility, where we will try to touch upon different parts of grassroots reality as well as policy action. And I'm hoping something a lot, actually, quite a lot of stuff in between, given the diverse expertise that we have with us over here today. With that, let me quickly introduce our panelists. First, we have with us Dr. Daria Oprishko. She's a media law consultant and Philip Schwartz Fellow at the University of Munster in Germany. She's also a member of the Working Group on Information Accessibility with UNESCO Information for All program. Next, we have with us Dr. Dibyaduti Roy. Dr. Roy is an assistant professor of cultural studies, media studies, and digital humanities, as well as the program director of the BA in cultural and media studies at the University of Leeds in the UK. Up next, we have Professor Jeffrey Rockwell. Professor Rockwell is the Canada CIFAR AI Chair and Professor of Philosophy and Digital Humanities at the University of Alberta. He's also a fellow at the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, or commonly known as AMI, in Canada. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Stuart Hilton with us. Mr. Hilton is the Director of Assurance and Compliance Services at Simtai Consulting Limited in Jamaica. Thank you so much, dear panelists, for taking the time and being with us here today. And we really appreciate it. I'm quite excited for this. So the way before we get into the questions, I was thinking we can discuss a bit of how we want to structure this conversation, so it's easier for our audience or viewers to even follow that. So I was thinking we might want to start with asking a few, like I would ask a couple of questions, and then requesting each panelist to go one by one and then respond to those questions, and we'll continue that for a bit. And once we are done with the questions that I have for you guys, then towards the end, we can open up the conversation to our audience and they can have the opportunity to then ask you all their own questions. So I hope that sounds good. And with that, let me just jump right into my first question. So there's been a lot of conversation that we know has been going on around two major things across the world, like irrespective of where you are from, but then two particular strands of conversations have been pretty common or consistent throughout, and those would be AI and secondly, climate action. So, in your personal opinion, or like what would be your personal response to the idea that AI as a general purpose technology should be treated as significantly as we do, say, the basic four elements of earth, like air, water, fire, and earth? And I think, like, as an additional question, I would want to ask how, if at all, can we synthesize climate action and action around climate crisis along with human centricity in AI? So I think I see Jeffrey first, right on my screen. So let's start with you, Jeffrey.
Okay, so I want to begin by saying that I don't think AI is a necessity the way air, water, fire, and earth are. So I don't see it as something that is necessary for life. It may seem that way given how much I use Chat GPT, but I can still remember when I didn't have access to it. The second thing, and I think everyone knows this, but we have to acknowledge the environmental impact of AI, both the incredible amount of energy that's needed to train these models, at least the large general purpose models, but even the impact of smaller projects and so on like that. I think there's an estimate that the International Energy Agency estimates that the amount of electricity that's going to be used by the AI industry is going to double by 2026. So this is going to have a significant impact. So then the question becomes, is there going to be a good, if you will, environmental return on the investment? Or are these systems being developed to entertain us, to produce pornography, to harass people and misinformation? And I think that's where policies, regulations, and, if you will, ethical direction comes in, that we can use this technology in all sorts of ways to assist, to work with people who are working on environmental impacts, or we can use it just to entertain ourselves as a new form of television, or it's something to sort of replace the decision making which we're tired of doing. I give, for example, an example would be cryptocurrency mining. There is potential there for cryptocurrencies, but it also seems that it's being used in all sorts of inappropriate ways and consuming a lot of power. Um, in the experience I have working with my colleagues, so I'm not a computer scientist myself, is that the environmental impact is going to happen at small scale. I have two colleagues that are working on AIs to make water processing more efficient, to reduce the amount of chemicals that are used in water processing here in Edmonton and then in Alberta. I think we're going to see lots of smaller projects where, in effect, AI helps with the automation of things that have an impact on our environment, our lived environment, and so on. And I think that's where we want to direct our energy and to support initiatives. And I'm going to stop there and pass it back to you, Ayushi.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I think, yeah, that's super important. I guess in a lot of our conversations around the digital, we tend to maybe like forget sometimes what's happening with the environment and like what's the environmental impact. Next, I can see Daria on my screen. I'm not sure if everyone sees them in the same order, but I guess that's the order we are following now. So, Daria, what do you think?
Thanks a lot for the question. And first of all, let me express my gratitude for having me here. It's a great honor to be here in such a great company today. And coming back to our question, in my view, we cannot equate air, water, fire, earth, and AI. I'm absolutely agree with Jeffrey that without air, without water, without earth, humanity cannot live. So they are essential conditions for human life on our planet. However, AI technologies, we have been living for some time without them. They, of course, will be of a great importance for the development of the humanity. The unavailability of those technologies or refusal, for instance, to use them will be probably the sign of backwardness. Those who use these technologies will undoubtedly have a competitive advantage in many public and social spheres, starting with economy, military, and so on. However, again, I completely agree with Jeffrey that there is another side of using AI technologies, and it is that they have a significant impact on our environment. It is very well known that data centers, the production and operation of all the equipment, as well as the use of artificial intelligence systems themselves, all of these contribute significantly to global carbon dioxide emissions, to huge energy and water consumption. And therefore, what we see that on one hand, AI technologies contribute to human development, to the development of mankind. However, on the other hand, they have quite a negative impact on the environment. And for this reason, the legal community is closely monitoring scientific research in the field of AI and its impact on human life and the environment, and is beginning to introduce first rules and standards aimed at enabling the technology to develop in the best interests of the society, in the best interests of the humanity. And on the other hand, to minimize the risks in regard to the introduction of this technology into life. For example, at the beginning of this year, the European Union adopted the so-called AI Act. And recently, a number of states signed the first international treaty in the field of AI. And here it is necessary to mention that AI Act, in this act, that the environment is explicitly referred to as one of the legal interests to be protected. However, I think that these are just the first steps in this area, and it is obvious that in future the legal regulation of AI will become increasingly developed and even more complex. So thanks.
Thanks, Daria. That was quite interesting to know, like about like how legal actions and legal policies can act or like help or not help in these kind of conversations. I think next I want to hear from Dr. Roy. Divya, if you want to go next, because I see you next.
Thank you so much. And firstly, I do want to express my thanks and gratitude to you and the entire panel. It's a great honor to be here, the Carnegie Council and UNESCO, for organizing this very important conversation. So I'm going to start by pushing back a little against the question itself. I don't think AI is a general purpose technology in its current formations. And I say that because this is not the first time AI has been hyped out. If this is the third hype cycle of AI, if not more, and let's go back to what led to the formation of this term AI. Goes back to 1956 when John McCarthy was trying to start the Dartmouth conference, and he needed an academic term to get a grant. And that's how AI was born, the term itself. We've moved from symbolic deductive logic to inductive neural networks. And therefore, I think I want to go back to the document that all of us have looked at, recommendations for ethics in artificial intelligence that UNESCO has come out with. And it makes a wonderful statement around in the beginning part where it says that we don't want to define AI because we understand it's a very fluid term. And I do want to come back to this fluidity to answer your question about air, water, earth. So I am a cultural analyst of dominant and emergent technologies. The word technology comes from techni, which is making. So air, water, earth, fire are natural elements. AI is not. So therefore, air, water, earth, AI can never be equated. For me, the key question here is not the technology. For me, the key question here is the human. For me to kind of go back to ontologies of AI or the act of AI itself, what do we understand by AI beyond the Gartner hype cycle, beyond what is understood to be the large tech versions of AI? I do think that there is a time to think about what kinds of humans are we privileging in these conversations, right? Who gets to have the definition of being a human in conversations around artificial intelligence? And I think that's the key point that I want to bring back, which goes back to some of the conversations that Kate Crawford's been talking about when she's talking of Atlas of AI, the planetary costs of artificial intelligence. You look around, and Daria mentioned, Jeffrey mentioned, the data centers all across the world. And this is true for every dominant technology. My PhD was on nuclear cultures. And all across the world, you will see nuclear testing happening in minoritized lands where inhabitants are always taken to task for those dominant technologies. So in many ways, I end with a very popular culture reference. It's like, who watches the watchman, right? So who watches the people who are making the AI? Who gets to ask those questions? And I'm so glad that six of us here and more around under your moderation, Ayushi, are able to ask that question here. So I pass on back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Divya. Yeah. I like some pushback. So let's see, Stuart, what do you think about it?
Thank you, Aisha, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I am in complete agreement with the panelists. AI, of course, is not essential. just like water, air, all the essential stuff that we need to live. But I do want to add a point around accessibility, because while it may not be essential, I think one of the important things is, are we making it accessible to the persons who want to access it, the persons who may be able to take advantage of what the models can produce? And a very important point that was added, I believe, by Jeffrey first, was the sustainability around using these AI models. And are we tackling the challenge of making sure that whatever models are being generated and the energy output that is needed, the carbon footprint, as mentioned by Daria, are we addressing those things that are impacting our environmental considerations? So, key to me is just making sure that we keep AI technology accessible. I mean, we in Jamaica are still trying to make sure that the internet is accessible to more persons. Just the raw infrastructure areas that allow people to try to create their own development in their own space. But once we tackle those things, making sure that the internet is accessible, making sure that our essential services, water, light, electricity, etc., are accessible, are we also providing a means for persons who do want to take advantage of these new models and technology, that they can access and use it in a responsible way?
I think this easily brings in the next question, and I don't say it just because I have to say something, because like as we were just discussing about how AI is not necessarily as, it's not like an element as compared to like fire, earth, water, and so on. But then I want to sort of unpack more fundamentals of AI and the principles governing it. So we were just like talking a lot about sustainability, accessibility, and some sort of like ethics of doing it as well. My next question would be that if you, as individuals in your own fields, in whichever kind of work you all do, if you were to choose one particular guiding principle to govern AI and responsibly use it, which one would it be and why? And I want to make it a bit more fun, which might seem a bit of an imposition right now, but we're going to do it. That if that that if speaker one says some particular um, principle, then the other speaker cannot choose that. So that the idea is that we will have a good range of principles. And so let's start with, again, you, Jeffrey, because you are who I see first.
Oh, that's great. So I don't have to worry about other principles.
Oh, you got lucky.
Yes. So I want to begin by saying a few things about principles, and just because I've got the pulpit right now. So I want to say, first of all, that principles are not enough to guarantee ethical uses of AI. I mean, there's been an explosion of principles. There's a paper from 2019 with the title "Principles Alone Cannot Guarantee Ethical AI," in which they talk about 84 different sets of principles. So we have to ask, what can principles do? And, in some sense, it's in the etymology of the word. They're the principio, they're the start, but they're not in some sense the end. Okay, so I've given my little speech about principles. I guess I'm going to pick partly, drawing on Dr. Roy. I'm going to pick meaningful human control, which I think in the UNESCO principles is articulated as human oversight and determination. But I like the more, to me, meaningful human control is the starting point for me. Thank you.
Perfect. Delia, what do you think would be your one governing principle?
A good question, because of course, all principles are very important, though definitely they are not enough to guarantee that the AI or the usage of AI is going to be ethical. I think that for me, I believe that development, training, and fine-tuning of AI systems and models shall be, first of all and foremost, transparent and explainable. Currently, it is acknowledged by many academics and practitioners that these processes lack transparency, which is actually essential to ensure respect for human rights, including the right to privacy and data protection. Of course, the development and the use of artificial intelligence should be responsible. And this means adhering to ethical standards and ensuring that the generated results do not reproduce, like gender stereotypes or discriminatory basis, or in the case that they do, to actively and proactively, let's say, to address them. Another important thing that also goes to questions of responsibility and transparency is that the use of AI technologies should not undermine trust in science, education, and knowledge itself. There is currently a very active debate regarding the potential use of AI in scientific research. In March, Andrew Gray from the University College London published a very interesting article suggesting that at least 1% of all papers published in the last year, so in the 2023, and it is around, I think, 60,000 or more papers, all of them were LLM assisted. Though, yes, the number of these papers could be even more. And the results of his research have sparkled discussions about the use of large language models in writing scientific papers. One argument is that the general expectation that scientific articles shall be written by humans, not by machines. Another argument is that using AI models can be quite risky because they often produce very inaccurate text, mixing words and putting them, let's say, in right order. And in science, it is kind of unacceptable. Therefore, I absolutely agree that, yes, we can have some principles, but everything depends on how a particular human, a particular science, or whoever use AI technologies. And the use of AI should be responsible and should not, in science especially, undermine the public trust in science and knowledge. Therefore, yeah, I think that the transparency and the use of AI, the responsible use of AI itself, is the most important in all these processes.
Thanks, Arya. So we have meaningful human control, and then we have transparency and responsibly using AI in that context. So let's see, Dibya, what do you want to add to this? And you obviously can't take the other two options because they're gone.
So yeah, no. So I had transparency, and Daria took that, but that's fine. I'll start off with a story. So I think a few months ago, I think in April of this year, there's these shops in North America that Amazon has called Just Walk Out. The understanding is that in these shops you go in, there's no human being, and you collect your objects, and then at the billing counter, a bill is magically generated. And it was realized that this magical generation of bill happens because there are 1,000 workers sitting back in India who look at the surveillance tapes and look at the itemized list and actually generate that bill. So why do I bring that story? I bring that story to say, if an AI, what we call as an AI system right now, which consists of data work and model work, 80% of that data work that runs the model is done from the global south in countries like India, Philippines, Kenya, where data annotation and the manual annotation that runs big tech in the global north is sourced from. And Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri have already termed this as ghost work. They have a fabulous book on this. There's, of course, examples of how Chat GPT's dataset is being cleaned by workers sitting in Kenya who work for less than $2 an hour, and they see enormous toxic content which they are traumatized by, and there is no form of medical insurance or help that can actually address these issues. Of course, Professor Rockwell and Daria also pointed out the idea of sustainability. So, for example, one normal Google search, by which I mean just an algorithmic Google search without AI powered, takes 1/10 of the energy that an AI powered search does. So, for me, the word bring it on down is accountability. Who's accountable? Right, at the end of the day, who am I able to ask the questions? Because algorithms and AI systems are not value neutral objects. Let's stop and first break that Wizard of Oz myth. There's someone behind the curtain, and usually it's underpaid global south workers who are exploited, not unlike how call centers or sweatshops worked in analog and digital past. So I'll stop there, and accountability is my word.
Oh, that's a wonderful one, because it's sometimes so many things are being packaged as AI, because like as you were saying previously, it's the hype train, and then but it's just humans working behind it, and that's kind of sad. Stuart, what do you think would be your principle?
The principle I think, given that I've worked in the privacy space for quite some time, a lot of persons think I go to that one first. But my primary principle that I'd focus on is inclusivity. Just because we're a smaller region, sometimes data is hard to get, and at times, as a region, the Caribbean region, we may get overlooked in terms of the considerations for what is sustainable development and inclusive policies on a global level, just because we're a much smaller population in the Caribbean as a whole. And I do think there's an opportunity for governments and for technologies being built to consider smaller regions and how our diversity may actually include and improve what are the policies being developed globally. So I look at the ability of AI technologies to look at these large models and so on, and think to myself, make sure to include our data as well. And when persons are getting to see the benefit of artificial intelligence and what it produces, then it will build greater trust and allow us to tackle more problems, because then we will be able to say, well, let's make more data available, given that we can benefit from these things on a global scale.
Thank you. I think, uh, like what I could gather from everyone's principles was somewhat around that. Okay, like even if we have principles, then how are we actually using them? Like if we have some policies on paper we have a lot of big words and big ideas and concepts, but how it depends a lot on how are we actually using them as human beings, as like what our intervention is going to be in, be it in terms of injustices across the world, or be it in terms of like how do we make sense of those particular principles that we are heading for. This would bring me to sort of my last question for today, and then we can open up for our audience question answer round. um, my question is that, somewhat related to this. So given that like our panel is called From Grassroots Reality to Policy Action, right? So I would want to talk a bit about policy action now. I was wondering if you want to talk a bit about what would you consider as most common roadblocks when it comes to policy action. And I understand like not all of us here at the panel work with policy making per se, but like if you were to talk about it from your perspective, from your discipline, or from your experience thus far in whichever field, what would you say that like how does a policy action translate into, let's say, like a local reality? Because as like we were talking about how there are issues around even internet accessibility, and there's digital divide, people, what we think of AI, let's say what is being sold off as AI in the global north is not actually AI, and it's people being underpaid and exploited in the global south to make build that facade of okay, this is actually AI. So in that setup, given the kind of inequalities that we have like sort of layered into the world, and not only just global north versus global south, but even let's say within the south, like south south inequalities as well. So what would you say would be, let's say, where does the citizen, where does an average citizen fall into this discussion? And does the policy roadblock affect the average citizen? And in, like, how can we weave these three components together? So let's start with Jeffrey. You.
Thank you again for some great questions. I'm going to bring up two issues that I think are important in policy. The first one is at what level, I think we've got to figure out at what level do we want policies. So, for example, San Francisco passes a law, a regulation banning face recognition in the city. Is that the right granularity? Is it something that's important to a city, or did they pass that because they did not trust the state of California or the United States, the federal government, to pass regulations around face recognition? Are they to some extent trying to provoke a discussion, if you will? Because regulations are not only, they are themselves communicative acts. So there's this question about the level and the granularity. And I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know what the answer is, but I think this is something that we're going to have to struggle with, especially since AI systems developed in other jurisdictions could end up having an impact on citizens in Canada. I mean, we're seeing right now that Brazil is struggling with X, and whether or not to, how to ban it, and whether or not they can regulate in various ways. So that's the first issue I wanted to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is agility. So one of the emerging paradigms for how AI should be regulated is a response, if you will, to the problem of AI is a shifting target. So you can't exactly sort of say, well, here are regulations that have to do with X, Y, and Z. So we saw in the EU, and we're seeing in the C27, the Canadian AI and Data Act, we're seeing regulations that define the risk. They don't define what AI is. Well, they do have definitions, but they're fairly sort of broad. But in the Canadian Act, which is not yet law, I should say, they talk about high impact risk. So, AIs that are potentially high impact will be subject to different types of regulations. So this is an attempt to have an agile policy which can adapt as new uses or misuses of AI come out. The problem with agility is that you have to have a knowledgeable civil service if you want to have agility. You have to have the staff that are part of whatever the ministry is that ends up regulating it. They have to have the learning and the ongoing capacity to stay on top of what's happening in industry. And so I think this is going to be a major problem for all jurisdictions, that it's a moving target, and you have to have the educated civil servants who have the freedom, the capacity to experiment with these things, learn about them, and then actually speak honestly about them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Daria, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Thank you a lot for the question. Good question, because I think I will bring also two main aspects, but they differ a bit from Jeffrey's. So we began this discussion with the fact that the development of artificial intelligence significantly influences ecology. And as we live in a world with limited resources, there is always a question of how to preserve them, how to preserve these resources, how to find a balance between the interests of the society in preservation of the environment and the interest of the society in the development of technologies. We are only at the beginning of creation of the development of the policy. Jeffrey also came up with a question on jurisdictions. It is a real huge question, and currently there is no international treaty that would be binding for all states and would solve this problem. So I think that a lot of things we will see how they develop in the future. And it also connects us with the climate change and environmental issues. However, another, not less important problem is connected with disinformation. And this disinformation that divides the society. And actually, in this regard, a lot of examples can be cited. Yeah, the example of Ukraine shows how destructive narratives are used for military purposes, and AI in this case, unfortunately, greatly facilitates the creation and dissemination of disinformation. For instance, many of you might know about the deep fake that appeared at the beginning of Russian full-scale invasion, showing that allegedly President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, allegedly calling Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms. However, there are many other examples because this year has become a year of elections throughout the world. And many researchers note a huge increase in disinformation and deepfakes aimed at distortion of the election results. According to a recent UNESCO global survey, around 87% of people are worried about the impact of disinformation on the elections in their countries, and they actually believe that it has already harmed their country's political life. And actually, we know that these AI technologies are often used to create disinformation, and not only actually to create, but to disseminate it as well. So here is the challenge for the policymakers. What shall we do with that? One of the examples of such intervention includes Slovakia, where just 2 days before their parliamentary elections in 2023, thousands of users of social networks shared quite a suspicious audio file, which presented a conversation between a journalist and the chairman of one political party that took part in these elections. And but this audio was such a bad quality that experts were able to conclude that it's a high degree of probability that it was AI generated. The problem here lied in the fact that this audio was disseminated during the so-called election moratorium. And it was very complicated for the affected parties to have some kind of possible reaction on this. Well, as I told that this is a huge challenge for policymakers, for the entire democratic world. In the European Union, policymakers tried their best, and this year adopted the Digital Services Act that is aimed inter alia on tackling disinformation online. In addition, in Europe, there are some kind of institutional, let's say, measures, and there is this European Digital Media Observatory, the so-called EDMO. And this institution brings together fact-checkers, media literacy experts, academic researchers. They collaborate with online platforms, with media organizations. And we can see how they analyze, assess disinformation and narratives, how they develop, how they involve AI technologies. And even considering that AI-generated content is very difficult to detect and label as such, EDMO created a pool of AI experts who could be potentially involved in addressing this AI-generated disinformation, especially during election campaigns or similar critical periods. And yeah, so I think that the policymakers have to, of course, follow the results of the implementation in Europe of the Digital Services Act, of the activity in the sphere of research, or activity in the sphere of media literacy.
Thanks, Arya. Divya, you're up next.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because we have limited time and I want to hear from the audience as well. So thank you, and I think those are all great points. But I do want to reflect on the UNESCO's document, which is the recommendations on the ethics for artificial intelligence, where they have this beautiful term, which is systematic normative reflection, right? That's what they want AI ethics to be. And I think that's so crucial because that systematic normative reflection is part of policy making. And as Professor Rockwell was pointing out, it's a great point about at what level. Is it at the policy, is it the state level, the city level, the nation level? But the word for me, Ayushi, if I want to bring it to one word, is techno-positivism. I think that's the greatest block for policymakers because by techno positivism I mean this inherent belief that technology will take us to something better, and that it is, we are all moving towards technology, and technology by nature has some essential aspect about it which makes it better always. And I also reflect on my former training or my current training as a digital humanist to also say that we don't use digital humanities tools just because we want to. It's because the research question demands it. So I do want to come back and end by saying I was hearing this talk by Professor Abhijit Vinayak Banerjee, the Nobel laureate. He was having a conversation with another economist Nobel laureate, Paul Romer, and they said that the ratio of inequality in the world, right, where you take the income of the top 10% and the bottom 50%, that's entirely gone up beyond comparison in the current times. And if AI has the capability to exacerbate that inequality, which it does clearly, as we see all around us, all of the examples that Daria mentioned, all of the examples that Jeffrey was pointing out, there needs to be an understanding this is an entirely new context. We can't apply rules from 50 years ago to current context because this is a new context. So I think from you take the low middle income countries, the least developed countries, and these nations, and therefore we have to think about the appropriate application of AI. So it's not a one size fits all, right? So that's very important. So I pass on back to you.
Thanks. Stuart, your quick thoughts on this, and then we can move on to our audience interaction as well.
Sure, I'll just pick right up from Divya talking about the use of AI. So I understand the policy question, but just ensure that as we think about policy in developing countries like the Caribbean, like throughout the Caribbean, that the policy ensures as best as possible that we are making sure we have that inclusivity I talked about before and accessibility. So for example, are we using the technology in a way that benefits society? Simple things like, and can enforce existing policy. When we talk about the Disabilities Act here in Jamaica, where we want to ensure that everybody is included regardless of your disability, can it be used for the benefit of disabled groups who, for example, may need to do simple services like taxes and aren't able to read the forms that are there? Can we use text-to-speech technology to allow them to hear what is there? Can we allow persons to build models that interpret what are our dialects, to enable more persons to hear and understand what information is available in these services? So as the policies get developed to enforce the use of AI in a responsible way, that we are able to use them in a way that is beneficial to more people and that it does become an easily accessible thing to more people throughout society.
Thank you so much, Stuart. I guess this brings us to the end of our discussion component for our panel discussion today. And now we have quite a lot of audience questions. I am not sure if we'll be able to cover all of them, but we're going to try. So, our first question is by Sylvia Furtado. They said that they would love to hear more about possible actions towards accessibility and what our panelists envision in these areas for a near future. So if there's anyone in particular who's feeling quite excited about this question, but if we can keep it like really short so that we can have more questions as well. Is there anyone who's feeling really excited about this? Like, do we have a vision here? There's so many visionaries here. I'm sure we have a vision here. Okay, Jeffrey, share your vision with us.
Okay, so I think there's two types of accessibility. There's the accessibility to of users to be able to use some of these tools, and I think part of the success of ChatGPT was the fact that it had an incredibly simple interface. It was like one field. You had type something in natural language, you hit return, and some sort of response. I think the accessibility that's going to be really important is accessibility to the technologies of development of training. And to that end, a number of people have pointed out that, especially for these large platform or foundation models, you need massive amounts of compute and power and so on like that. And these are really only available to a small number of companies that have the billions of dollars to do it. And to that end, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, has in fact announced $2 billion to go to compute so that we can have a made in Canada accessible compute platform for people in industry and researchers who don't want to be doing this using Amazon or one of the Microsoft or one of the big compute platforms. Thank you.
Perfect. I think let's move. Okay, so we have Divya. Yes,
No,
share.
just wanted to add in, just to add to Professor Rockwell's point, there's a difference between the digital and digitality, which I think is very crucial to accessibility, right? So digital might be more global, and the digitality is far more local. So I think going to Stuart's point about how he's talking about how we need those questions to be asked in terms of that very local context. So again, accessibility is not a transcendental signifier here. Accessibility is always local. It's a local question.
That's so fair. I think then we have another question. This is by Gargi. They say it can be argued that the internet is becoming more oligarchical every day. Can this be prevented from happening or continuing with AI realistically? If yes, then how? And how can the average person contribute to this effort? I saw quite a lot of nodding heads and smiles when this question popped up. So, who is feeling excited about this? Dibya, let's go.
I think the internet was always a place of control. I think it's just so. I think I love that essay by Tim Berners-Lee, which is called "Long Live the Web," and he talks about his original conversations around not the internet but the World Wide Web, because he makes that distinction. So I think I would reflect back on a scholar that many of us are quite fond of, Professor Alexander Galloway, who writes Protocol: How Control Exists After Decentralization. And I think it makes quite clear that the infrastructure of the World Wide Web, if you take the TCP IP and the DNS, they are structures of control. The W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, is a private organization. Let's not forget that. So let's not imagine that the web was always a great autonomous space that suddenly become clustered with control with AI. So I would like to believe things are getting better, but I'm not entirely sure it has always been good.
That's fair. That's fair. It's I think it's always good to remember the history and the trajectory of how things have shaped up. I guess we have time for maybe one more question and then I can hand over to Caudle. Okay, so okay, now I have to choose which question we go for, and I don't like doing this, but okay, we will go for it. Yes, this is by Clovis. They've asked, with the discussion on AI and information accessibility, I would like to hear our panelists' thoughts on how AI may impact the traditional education system and which policy should be adopted to ensure the educational level is kept to its standard, or why not, or even improved. So I can repeat. So I think they are trying to ask a question around how AI may impact traditional education system and what sort of policy interventions can be made to address if AI enters the traditional education system. It could be good for the good or for the bad, and what can we do about it? And since we have quite a lot of people in education, largely. Let's see. And even if not, then, I mean, we're all educated here, luckily. Yeah, there, yeah. I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you. For education, it's of course a challenge because we see that the approaches of how to we shall educate our children or students, they're changing. Once I've read that I think in Lithuania, they in one of the universities they came up with an experiment, and two professors of the law faculty, they made the AI generated clone of themselves and trained this clone on their materials, so articles, books, and whatever. And afterwards, this clone was used by the students for assessing the project, not project, but the tasks that they gave to the students. It's quite an interesting approach. I wonder what are the results actually they received, but it shows, this case shows that the system of education, it also beginning to change. And it will definitely change because as I've mentioned, and all of us know, that the results that are generated by the AI systems that often are inaccurate. They just put some correct words in correct order, but it doesn't mean that in the end, the answer will be also correct. So I think that we have to really pay attention to this aspect and follow the results of such experiments and see how we can modify our system of education to tackle, to face these new challenges and to be more effective, and so that the new generation will be more effective.
I think scientific inquiry and curiosity is always a good point to end a discussion on. So I guess this is we've come to the end of our discussion. Thank you so much, panelists, for taking out your time and chatting with us. I really hope the audience liked it, and I'm sorry to audience members whose questions we were not able to take up. I'll hand it over to you, Caudal, now.
Well, thank you very much, Ayushi. Thank you very much to the panelists. It's very clear to me, listening to all of you, that this question of moving from grassroots to policy, a point of departure was Jeffrey's intervention, which is principles are not enough to deliver ethical AI. There's another critical P, which is people. To Debia's point, he didn't say human centricity, but that the question around AI and AI governance is also a question about what is the quality of being human, and that we must keep that at the center of our interrogation, including ensuring that people in the global south that the question is not just about them being mere consumers in this new phase of development, but also that we address the question of people being digital scavengers, which is certainly not going to yield a better world. I understand from the conversation that the challenge to AI being a general purpose technology is really a challenge as to whether it's not so much, in my view, a debate about whether this is a general purpose technology, but a question of what lens are we using, hype or aspiration? And if we are to really be serious about AI as a rising tide lifting all ships, then let us remember the critical P, which is that this is really about people. And in this regard, the people of the global south should be a priority, because accessibility is also about enlightened access. So let us all put our shoulders to the wheel and start to address critical needs such as digital media and information literacy. Thank you so much for your invaluable insights. And we look forward to the other conversations across the world, in China, in India, in Canada, in Jamaica, in Colombia, which will all happen between now and September 27. And then we invite you to join us on September 28th. Remember, it's a Saturday, but put aside some time to come on GatherTown for the flagship Artificial Intelligence for Information Accessibility Conference. From Jamaica, big up on yourself. Thank you. Have a good day. Take care.
Bye.